Tonight we're in Lesson 24, the second part of that, the Maccabean Revolt and the independent Jewish state. We saw that these were, again, things prophesied by Daniel. We mentioned briefly from Daniel 8 and 11, those prophecies of the despicable one who would end the regular sacrifice, and it would be stopped for 2,300 evenings and mornings until the sanctuary was restored. So we saw that by way of prophecy. Then we looked at the historical accounts, and those historical accounts are in the section that's included in some Bibles, the works known as the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books, particularly the histories of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are two tellings of this history. They have a lot of overlap and a few independent stories for each other, or from each other. And so we saw that there was a hardship that led to great revolt. In this, again, we just very briefly look at our general time scale. We talk about the Greeks and their takeover of the Bible world and all the lands around it. As prophesied, the Maccabean Revolt is the Greeks becoming a little bit more independent within that realm, and soon we'll have the Romans. So almost from the time that the Greeks conquered, it wasn't but about 100 to 150 years till the Romans start their conquest and their political rule. They're never the cultural force that the Greeks are, but they have the political rule. And they also, when they are in charge of this area, after the independent Jewish state, they will give us the Herods as the rulers for the times of the Gospels. And then we'll finally look at in the last lesson, kind of wrap up several of these loose ends and also put these things toward the gospel background and how these events and facts shape the world and views in the times of the Gospels. So oppression, persecution, self-rule, and success lead to another set of problems. That's where we are tonight. In this 100-year-ish, round number, years of independent rule before the Romans come. So we had the hardships that led to revolt, as was prophesied. The record of those things in the books of the Maccabees, and our lesson has a couple of very short excerpts from those books. Those are quite lengthy books. And they will talk about the view of the Jews. That's another point of these apocryphal books. These books were included with the Septuagint translation. Septuagint translation was one of the ancient bestsellers. It was a book that was well known, and anybody who was interested would have been able to read what was there, know what was there. And it was taught in the synagogues. And so this was certainly, when you read the books of the Maccabees, you certainly have the Jewish outlook on these events in the time of Christ. That with the success of that revolt and the purification of the temple, we have the origin of the Hanukkah story, which we just put here, not so much because it's really important for the New Testament, but just because this is when it occurred, and if we're going to ever mention it, this would be the time. And then we were talking about last week this century of Jewish rule. The Jews were able to make mostly, as they wanted, their own kingdom. The Jews under the Hasmonean dynasty, and the dynasty is named after one of the ancestors of Judas Maccabee. It's Matthias's either father or grandfather was named Hasmonean. And so this Hasmonean dynasty, this independent rule, they will, and oops, I forgot to turn the projector on. I've been swiping up here with my slides, showing myself my slideshow, and nobody mentioned that the slideshow wasn't on. So in a moment, we hopefully will see. There we are. So I know you can't probably see the details there. Certainly you can recognize the outline there of the Bible Holy Lands, with the exception of the area right around the old Philistine heartland, right around, Ashkelon. Sorry, that's what it is. So with the exception of the area right around the old Philistine area of Ashkelon, the Jews controlled, in their independent kingdom, an area eventually almost as large as what Solomon controlled. And the different colors on that map represent the different times when they expanded outward. But it's not so much important just to know when they had it, but that they basically, the Jews for a time, conquered everybody. And in some respects, this independent Jewish kingdom, under the Hasmonean dynasty, was larger than what David and Solomon conquered, in that they even took the old areas of Edom and Moab. And you recall that when Israel went to conquer the land, they certainly could have conquered those lands, but they didn't because God told them not to. God told them not to take the lands from their relatives. Even though they had provoked them, they were not to take that territory. Well, in this kingdom, they didn't bother with that. They just went ahead and took it. And that's one of the things that Herod is a descendant of the last of the Edomites. He was from one of their noble families, and that noble family intermarried with the Jewish noble families after the conquest. And Herod, with his political maneuvering and his friendship with the Romans, eventually ends up in charge of the entire empire, which will be a story for another lesson. But this conquering of all their neighbors, that the Jewish kingdom was quite happy with that for a time, because of the Samaritans who troubled them. The Samaritans troubled them before they went to captivity, and we read that in the Scripture. And when the temple was raised by Nebuchadnezzar, the Samaritans and the Moabites and the Edomites and those neighbors round about, they all stood like spectators at a sporting event cheering on the Babylonians. And it really got the ire of the Jews and really provoked them even deeper into their grief at that terrible time. And the Samaritans and these other folks, again, after the captivity, they troubled the Jews. And we read about that in the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra. We also see them intermarrying, though, don't we? Because what was one of the reasons why in the book of Nehemiah that the Samaritans had so much influence over the Jews? Because they were intermarried with the noble folks. And so when the Jews get their own kingdom, they get to solve temporarily nearly all of these problems by just conquering everybody. And so, did these people trouble you? All right, well, we'll just take them over. And so the Samaritans had their rival temple to the temple at Jerusalem set up on Mount Gerizim. And in the days of this independent kingdom, how'd they deal with that? They conquered it and knocked it over. No more rival, right? Of course, what happens when they lose their power? How much animosity is there for the future? And in the New Testament, the Samaritans, they won't even let the Jews walk through their territory to go to Jerusalem, will they? And it relates to those excesses. They also force the Samaritans to be circumcised. And so, just adding more to the list of grievances the Samaritans would have against the Jews. But it also explains why in this entire area, which is not Judea and is not Galilee, and Galilee's up there on the north side, because if you think about it, when we end the Old Testament, the Jews are down in Jerusalem. When we go to the New Testament and begin the Gospels, where are the Jews? They're down in Jerusalem, but they're also up in Galilee. And what's in between? The Samaritans. And I always wondered as a kid, last time we read the story, the Jews are all down there, and now they're on two sides. Well, why is that? Well, this is why. And so the Jews had resettled and populated almost exclusively the northern part of this, which up in Galilee. And so this success of the independent kingdom really, in some ways, goes to their head as success. What happens in successful empires? in successful kingdoms. People get wealthy and people get proud. And that happened here with this Jewish empire. So they had a century. Again, that's a round number, ever so slightly longer than that. They had a century of their own rule. And so they were able to push into the areas that the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid dynasty had held on to as a rule from Damascus. But as that kingdom of the Greeks got weaker and weaker, the Jews took more and more of their territory. They also pushed south as the Ptolemaic kingdom down in Egypt. That was also weakening. And so they were able to take territory in between these two kingdoms, where once they were kind of the middle of the sandwich between these two powerful Greek kingdoms. In this period, they carve out a large space for themselves and push them back in both directions. And so one of the things that happens is, with this successful and it's sometimes pretty prosperous state, you end up with political parties. And so just yesterday, we had our political primaries. And come November, we're going to have our general election. And we've divided up into parties over these things, haven't we? And so there'll be this partisan infighting, and there'll be partisan groups. And there's one thing I'm really glad always about elections. I'm really always glad when they're over. I appreciate when they're over. Because of all the infighting that this group does against that group, it can kind of tamp down for a few minutes. Of course, when does the next election cycle start? About 2 days after they sweep up the confetti from the party for winning. But in any case, some partisanship never goes away. But in this Jewish kingdom, they developed various parties. And there's always one party who supports who's in charge. Doesn't matter how corrupt a country or how good a country, there's always a loyalist party, right? And why are the loyalist parties, why are they often so loyal? No matter what the country is, why is there always a party that's loyal to the government? Yeah, they work for them. They get commissions into the army, or they get various concessions to run this business or that business, or they're the ones who are the caterers, or they're the ones who but somehow they're connected with power and money to the political powers. And so once the Hebrews, and they set up, and sometimes you'll see this word to describe this, I can't say these words, so I don't usually. Hebrastic, a kingdom of Hebrews. Anyway, this Hebrew kingdom, we're going to have a loyalist party. Now, we do know this loyalist party from the New Testament. In the New Testament, who's the loyalist party to those in power? Those are the most loyalist. They're the ones that are most with Herod. And the people they usually kept company with were the Sadducees. And so the Sadducees during this Jewish kingdom, and then once Herod takes over, some of them even go a little farther off into the. It's almost like the Ba'ath Party of Iraq before Saddam Hussein was thrown out. The Sadducees become the loyalist party to the Hasmonean rulers. And so the other thing that's interesting with this is, why was it that the Hasmonean ancestors, Judas and Matthias and those others, why was it that they were the leaders of the revolution? What was their position that caused them to be able to begin a revolution? Yeah, they were priests. Yes, their ancestors were priests. And they weren't the high priest. They were, just regular priests. But still, that was a high position, high caste in Israel. And it was the revolution started when their grandfather, great-grandfather, however many generations we want to go down, and which period we're talking about. But one of their direct ancestors was a local priest who was asked to give sacrifice to a pagan deity in the order of the Greek authorities, and Matthias refused. When another man went up to offer the sacrifice when the local priest wouldn't do it. One of the guys who was following along with the local Greek officials, when he went up to do it instead, Matthias killed him. And the Jews viewed that as an act like Phinehas in the Old Testament, stopping the adultery with the Moabites. And the Jews celebrated that greatly. And when the priest who killed the man who was offering the pagan sacrifice, when they said, "Who's ever for God and with me, come on," and they fled to the hills and started the revolt. But it was a revolt started by a family of priests. Well, this family of priests proved to be very capable leaders. Matthias, his son, Judas, the big one, the main name, but the others as well, Jonathan and Simon, and then his grandson is really the first real ruler of a united country, John, his grandson John. Not only are they now leaders of the rebellion and then successful leaders to the point that they become the rulers of the new kingdom, they are still what? They're still priests. They're still priests. And the prior priest, the priest at the time of the Greek rule, when all these terrible things were going on, they had kind of knuckled under and compromised with the Greek authorities. And so do you want that guy to be the high priest anymore? If there's a persecution of the church, and everybody is supposed to renounce Christ to live, and the preacher is one of the guys who has renounced Christ so he could live, when the revolution happens and now we can free to be Christians again, can that guy still be the preacher? Even if he repents, you want him to be the preacher? Trial basis. Yeah, see how it goes. So I just need to know where my limits are. I just need, in case there's persecution, I need to know what my limits are as to how far I can compromise and still be able to come back. Well, it's easier to get rid of a preacher than a priest because, why? Why is it so much easier to get rid of a preacher than a priest? It's not hereditary. In the Jewish system, it's a hereditary system, right? And so let me ask you, which of my sons do you think has the inside track to take over after I leave? Okay, it's modern times. Which of my sons or daughters? Okay, I see, I'm seeing no. Would that give them any inside track here at all? Well, I mean, if I did my job well and y'all liked them and remembered them well, do family connections help preachers get jobs? I know they do. But do you get it because you're in the family? No. The preacherhood is not exclusive to genealogy. But this high priesthood is, right? But these men said, we're not letting those guys back. Well, who gets to be the high priest then? If we're not going to let these guys who compromise themselves, if we're not going to let them back, who's going to get to be the high priest? They said, we are. And they started appointing some of their relatives. And so relatives of the Jewish rulers become the priest, and these other relatives and priests who now have, now all these priests are now cousins of the king, second cousins of the king, right? They didn't used to be second cousins of the king, but when one of the priests becomes a king, what is now all the priests? They're now the king's closer relatives. And so that's why we get this connection in the New Testament of these political priests. When we read the Gospels and we read the book of Acts, how much time is spent explaining about the priests doing their priestly duty, and how much time is spent explaining about them getting in arguments about political posturing? And I think, why are these guys so political? Because the chief priests are related to this family of rulers. And so we have this uniting of king and priest. Now let me ask you, as Christians, how much are we for uniting of king and priest? Everybody say, no, we're not for that at all. Except for what? We got one who is a prophet, a priest, and a king. So these offices are going to be united. It's in the prophecy of Zechariah, isn't it? But this isn't it, is it? This isn't it. And so we have these Pharisees who develop. They end up intertwining the priesthood and this elite ruling class. And over time, these guys get less and less religious. And so what are some of the doctrinal things we know about the Pharisees from the New Testament? What do they not believe in? Sadducees. I'm sorry, Sadducees. I misspoke. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in spirits.
Is it basically everything but the first 5 books?
So they said, right, they did not take as authoritative the writings of the prophets. Just like we take the Apocrypha, and what do we do when somebody quotes to us the Apocrypha? Whatever. If somebody would quote to those guys Daniel or Joel, what would they do? Whatever. Can you imagine that? That's how. So they claimed we can only rely on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, even there, would there not be thought of an angel? Certainly. Would there not be the conclusion, maybe it's not real directly spoken, but would you not conclude that there's a resurrection? I think you would. But what we have is this ruling, secular, elite, political class, but they're also the priest of the nation. And they're in charge of many of the equivalent of, theological universities and ordination things and religious instruction and that kind of thing.
They must have been missing most of the prophecies of Christ.
Right.
And, prophecies that you'd be more likely to reject.
Oh, especially if I can't imagine not accepting the Psalms as authoritative. Not even the writings of David. But there would be, if you just had the first 5 books, you still would know of the Messiah coming, I think. Deuteronomy 18 particularly comes to mind. Or Genesis 3, but that's a theme that may have been a little too subtle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Christ spends most of his criticism on the Pharisees, and it's almost like he doesn't waste his breath on the Sadducees.
I think so. So let's talk about those other guys. Let's talk about the Pharisees. So, if you have in charge of your religious institutions, your temple, and in charge of your government, people who are the equivalent of theological liberals, unbelievers almost, at some point just almost unbelievers, some may be believers, but not a lot. And they're for the government, and what would you do? What would you do? Well, there's been a popular book among Christians, or at least some segment of Christians in Christendom, American Protestants, and some Catholics too, in the last, 10 or 15 years, The Benedict Option. Matt, you're familiar with the book, The Benedict Option, right? And what is the thesis, or what's the contention of the book called The Benedict Option?
That as society becomes more secular, Christians will have to kind of band together more as more insular communities because we're not the culture anymore. Historically, Christianity was kind of just taken for granted as part of the culture. The thesis is you can't take that for granted anymore.
So we're going to basically need to band together in these little fortresses or outposts. We might even call them monasteries, but not quite. But we're going to basically build an alternative set of institutions. We're going to have to make our own colleges. We're going to have to make, in some cases, our own communities even. But a parallel set of institutions that are more Christian and less secular. Well, what major institution did we study in the last lesson that's not known in the Old Testament, but is a bedrock thing in understanding the Gospels? The synagogues. The synagogues, you cannot understand the New Testament without understanding the synagogues. As these things in this Jewish kingdom is developing in a parallel time and getting about a 100-year head start, is this institution of the synagogue. And the synagogue becomes a place where people go for what? Religious fellowship and religious instruction. They go there weekly for worship. They sing the Psalms. They listen to the law and the prophets. And we know in the New Testament, it doesn't say Old Testament. What does it usually say? It says law and prophets most of the time. So they read from the law, and they also specifically do what? They also read from the prophets, what the Pharisees or the Sadducees reject. So they're specifically reading from both sections of the Scripture, and they are there engaged in edification, in every kind of spiritual thing, in charity, and in many ways the synagogues they're very largely parallel to the church. Who's running the synagogues? Even in the Gospels, who's in the synagogues? The Pharisees. The Pharisees are running the synagogues. I imagine we could maybe find some Sadducee synagogue somewhere, maybe in Jerusalem, within a block of the temple. But there wouldn't have been a lot of them. The Pharisees began as religious and political opponents to the Sadducees. The Pharisees have a couple of good arguments. They say, you are the wrong family to be the king. They say you are the wrong family to be the high priest. And they say you have the wrong approach to the law. And so it's basically a popular and conservative religious revolt against this secular political priesthood and leadership of their kingdom. And now, once the Romans take over, which was about 60 years before Christ was born, 65-ish years, so about 100 years before the gospel stories take place. That had been about 100 years. These divisions still exist because the priesthood is still there, but they don't have the political power directly. They have it indirectly. But these divisions still exist of religious approach and attitude and demeanor. And the Pharisees are always the party of the people. So they're the leaders of the people who are reading the book of God. They're the leaders of the people who are objecting to political overreach and political corruption of their religious authorities who are secular and liberal. I got to say, it's scary to me at times because it almost sounds, when you talk about the origin story of the Pharisees, it almost sounds like conservative Republican Christians. They have a lot of the same basis of attitude. Now, it is now, when we get to the Gospels, it's 150 years on. But they still wear these names, and they still have some of these principles. But over the 150 years between their formation and the time of the Gospels, what have they done? They claim to follow the book of God, and they read the book of God every single week. But in 150 years, what have they done? They added a whole lot of tradition. And do their leaders become, in many ways, mirrors of the people that they originally formed up as a group to object to? They do. But to me, that's to know that this is their origin. The popular objector party, who's reading the Bible weekly, that's their origin. If we only knew them from the Gospels, though, would we think that's where these people came from? We might not recognize that that's where these people came from. There are clues that this is where these people came from, because do they have with them lawyers and people who know the law well? And are they in the synagogues where they're reading the book? Yes. And is every synagogue a place of heartless officials who are just bound up with tradition? Not all of them. But as a group and as a class, what are they generally known for? That's what they're known for. So, that's where the Pharisees come from. They start as this party objecting to the secular corruption, irreligiosity of the ruling families of this independent state. And now, again, when the Romans take over and they're no longer independent, the Sadducees party, the Pharisees party, these continue, and who knows, without the judgment of God in 70 AD to destroy the whole system, who knows how long that would have gone. I think there's a lot of parallel with the Hasidic Jews today and the Pharisees. I think there's an awful lot of overlap of mindset and some teaching. But in any case, the Pharisees and their rabbis kind of form an alternative option for worship and leadership and understanding of spiritual things to this corrupt, priestly, almost, it's not quite a cabal, that's a little too strong, but this intermarried, it's not quite inbred, but pretty close, this interlocking group of people at the top in the priesthood. Okay, so questions or comments as we finish up there, lesson 24. I think the Hasidic Jews are an awful lot like the Pharisees, the Hasidim. They want to be separate, like the Pharisees. They want to be separate and set apart from the world, and so they do very peculiar things that make them different, all the way to the way they dress. They have their own schools. Their social life is entirely within the group. And so the Hasidic Jews have an awful lot of parallels with the Pharisees. Matt?
I've often thought, are the temptations that face churches of Christ and other conservative-like denominations, we don't have as much of a temptation to be like the Sadducees,
Because we don't have cousins who are the elite of society.
None of us are like friends, which would be like Harvard, Yale.
Right. The tendency to become like a Sadducee is much more apparent, say, in the Episcopalian church, where your cousins are senators.
Right. But we should take warning from the example of the Pharisees, because I think that's where the devil tempts us.
That's right.
Like them. So that's really a cautionary tale there.
Yeah, I think it's a very cautionary tale. When you think about, again, the thing that the basis of their party was valid objection, and their response of, we're going to read the law and the prophets, and we're going to worship in our community. That's a great response.
But all those traditions that seem so crazy to us, but not to Christ.
150 years of putting a little on, a little on, a little on, a little on.
They all started off with the idea that we're going to put these traditions around the law to make sure we don't violate the law.
Right.
Something that's not necessarily a bad idea. But
We're not only going to not violate the law, we're not going to come close to it. So we're going to have the law, and then we're going to put a hedge around the law, and we're not even going to get into the hedge. And somehow the spirit of the whole thing is entirely lost by many. Again, it's not every synagogue. You think about when the gospel, one of the good approaches to know how these things are is, what's the response when the gospel is preached in the synagogue? Is this a synagogue where the gospel is received and Jesus and his messengers are warmly welcomed? And there were some of those. Or is this a synagogue where the officials get up and object?
Well, a lot of the early Jewish converts were from the law, from the scribes and the Pharisees.
They were. That's right. And then also a large body of priests in Acts 6. But it's also true that as the Pharisees at times were fuming of what Jesus was doing in their own synagogues, what were the people doing? The people were receiving, the people were rejoicing. I think in particular that terrible case where the lady has been bent over for 18 years and Jesus heals her. And what's the synagogue guy say? You're healing on the wrong day, sir. Come back another day if you want a healing. This is the Sabbath. And Jesus just, forget it, and heals the lady, and he's fuming, and the people are rejoicing and astonished. And so one of the things one of those stories probably also tell us is, if we think we're the leader of people and getting them all in the tight confines of our tradition and our teaching, when something good happens and we refuse to recognize it because the wrong guy did it or it happened in the wrong way, the people probably still know it's a good thing. So the people that saw through some of this. But these guys were such gatekeepers of the synagogue and gatekeepers of the people that Jesus butts heads with them continually. That's our time. Next week we'll end this lesson. I thought we would tonight, but didn't quite get there. We'll end by looking at our questions. We have a set of questions for lesson 24, and then we'll go into lesson 25. Lesson 25, we'll get to the Romans. Not the book of Romans, the actual Romans.